Welcome, everyone, to the Lunchtime Lecture Series at the University of Michigan's Environment and Sustainability School, our EJ program. Environmental justice is a field that was co-founded in our school with a much broader community that reached beyond our school into Detroit and across the country back in the 1990s. I'm honored today, as a faculty member in our program, that I'm joined by multiple generations of thinkers and practitioners in this environmental justice space. My name is Rebecca Hardin, and I have served this year as the administrative lead for the EJ program. In that capacity, I must remind you that we have a fabulous cross-campus certificate program currently enrolling students for next year. Those deadlines are April 30th, so if you have an interest or one of your students or colleagues has an interest, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and join our fold even more in a more sustained manner. I will also just say that while we ordinarily begin our work with a land acknowledgement that talks to the erasures of land and labor within a university like ours, our group of students, the working group of students who have organized and conceptualized this lecture series alongside me this year, have elected to put the land acknowledgement towards the end of the seminar in a way that reflects on the relationships between the content brought in by our illustrious guests and the challenges of making a land acknowledgement feel less perfunctory and more meaningful as an exercise. So that'll be coming up, and I will let you know that one of our students, Sam Buck, will be stepping in after our guest's lecture with those thoughts and comments, and also moderating our questions and answers today. Now, our guest today will be introduced by my colleague, Paul Mohai. David Pellow is with us from early California morning, and I want to thank him for being here and say that my colleague, Paul, is someone who's been a remarkable mentor, friend, and beacon in the field of environmental justice. Part of the group of faculty here who co-founded not only the program, but in many ways the discipline of environmental justice. I know no one who has been more persistent and persuasive in trying to put rigorous research about the inequities of environmental policies and politics at the heart of change at the state, local, and national levels over the course of his career. It is my delight to introduce to all of you my incoming Associate Dean for Research and Professor in the Environmental Justice Program, co-founder of the program, Paul Mohai, to introduce David Pellow. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Thank you for that very, very nice introduction. Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor David Pellow. I want to start off by saying he is one of the pioneering scholars in the field of environmental justice, and he and I have known each other for a long time. I consider him a good friend and a colleague, and we've also co-authored a couple of papers together. But let me give some more of his background. He's currently the Dehlsen Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. He's also the Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project there. He teaches courses on social change movements, environmental justice, human-animal conflict, sustainability, and social inequality. He earned a BA in sociology at the University of Tennessee and an MA and PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. He's had a very prolific career. He's the author or co-author of over 70 books, book chapters, and peer-reviewed journal articles, including such widely cited and influential works such as Environmental Inequality Formation Toward a Theory of Environmental Injustice, Garbage Wars, the Struggle for Environmental Justice in Chicago, Environmental Justice, Human Health, and Environmental Inequalities, Toward a Critical Environmental Justice Studies, Black Lives Matter as an Environmental Justice Challenge, and so many more books and articles. Obviously, I don't have time to read them all. I would encourage everybody to look him up on Google Scholar. He's a very, very widely cited author. He's here today to talk to us about theorizing and advancing environmental justice politics in the 21st century. And it's my real pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Pellow.
All right, thank you so much for that generous introduction, Paul, my good friend and colleague. And thank you to Dr. Hardin as well for organizing this event. What I'd like to do today is to give you an overview of some of the projects that I've been working on throughout my career, and I'll conclude with a discussion of my current project. I want to make sure I'm monitoring the time here. Okay, so it's a bit after noon your time there. I also appreciate the point about the land acknowledgement. I'll make a brief one now. I'm coming to you from what we now call Santa Barbara, California, which is unceded, indigenous, traditional Chumash lands, waters, and territories. And I just want to thank the Chumash leadership of several bands here for giving me and my colleagues the chance to build and rebuild relationships of respect, trust, and reciprocity between our university and their clans, nation, band, and tribe. So let me continue then with a screen share if I can do that. There we go. And today, as Paul said, I'll be talking about theorizing and advancing environmental justice politics in the 21st century. Let me begin by talking about three of the guiding questions that really frame and structure pretty much most of my work. And I think, will have resonance with just about anybody working in the space of environmental justice. And they are: how are social inequality and environmental quality linked? What roles do social movements play in shaping environmental policy? And that second one is really important for me as we have the whiplash from the last regime to this current presidential administration. We see the fruits of the labor of folks like Rebecca and Paul really paying off in terms of really the embrace of climate and environmental justice at the highest levels of government. So it's really not all doom and gloom. We are actually seeing the effects of the scholarship and the social movement fomenting change at the highest levels. And related to that is this third bullet point: how can we improve people's quality of life and promote ecological sustainability? And to me, these are three questions that are really at the heart of environmental justice studies. In terms of the methodological approaches I use, I'm a qualitative researcher, and I draw on ethnographic methods, participant observation, interviews, archival research, and activist scholar work where I'm doing collaborative participatory research with folks in communities that are affected by environmental and climate injustices. Folks who are on the fence line, folks who are on the front lines of these struggles. So as I said, I want to basically do a bit of an overview, a survey of some of the work I've done over the past several years, a few decades maybe. My dissertation was a project that turned into this book, Garbage Wars, and I thank Tom Mayer for coming up with that title. And this is a book I looked at roughly, 12 decades of struggles against waste facilities in the city of Chicago among European immigrant communities, working class, low wealth communities, communities of color from 1880 to the year 2000. And one of the things I did there was to really hone in on the issue of labor and how workplace environments are also really important sites of environmental justice struggles, and also the fact that there are complexities in so many environmental justice struggles. So I honed in on at least a few examples in that book where people of color at a higher level of socioeconomic status, or people of color who enjoyed greater political power, were able to use those resources as leverage to keep their own neighborhoods clean, but to dump on other folks of color in collaboration with white-led industries and governments. So I did my best to try to complicate what I think at that time was an overly simplistic narrative of how environmental injustice has unfolded. Building on that work, around the same time, my collaborator Lisa Sun-Hee Park and I did some work in Silicon Valley, where we were also looking at the labor environment there, which is extremely toxic. And of course, we look at the IT or the electronics industry globally, and it's one of the most toxic and poisonous environments you can be in anywhere in the world. And this, at least in the United States, and in places like China, Nigeria, Ghana, we're seeing an intersection of gender, race, ethnicity, in some cases religion, with environmental threats in the workplace, thus allowing us to really expand and amplify in our reach in terms of why people are facing environmental injustices, what categories of difference really matter in various parts of the world, various sectors. and understanding that it's not always just about one particular category of difference, that, for example, gender matters a great deal in places like India and in Ghana. We have, for example, e-waste recycling, where ethnicity and religion matter a great deal with respect to whether folks are going to be affected. Building on some of that work, we back in the early 2000s, a whole group of folks got together in San Jose, California, to launch the International Campaign for Responsible Technology. So these were human rights lawyers, labor rights activists, environmental justice folks, scholars, and mainstream environmentalists. We're saying, this is the IT industry, the electronics industry is just one of the most toxic on earth. We don't want to shut this down. We do want to see if we can promote environmental and climate justice and maybe even a just transition in this industry. And I was surprised that one of the very first things that this network said that we wanted to do was to engage in deeper research and documentation on this problem. And so they commissioned a number of us to write a book on this issue. And so that became this book, Challenging the Chip: Labor Rights and Environmental Justice in the Global Electronics Industry. And I think more non-academics are involved in the contributions of this book than there are academics. And folks have used this book as a tool for mobilizing resources and for mobilizing people to clean up that industry. And I will say that RCA, which is pictured here on the cover, they were the subject of a recent successful lawsuit by workers who've been poisoned in various parts of Asia. We've advanced a number of campaigns to reduce toxic use inputs in industries such as HP, Compaq, IBM, Dell, on, and to try to improve the workplace environment of folks doing this labor, this toxic labor, and folks who are on the other side of those industry walls and the fence line and the front lines of the communities. Continuing with some of these themes, particularly around immigration and work and the environment, Lisa Sunhee Park, my often collaborator, and we found ourselves doing some work in the state of Colorado. And for us, this was really fascinating when someone said, if you're interested in environmental justice and thinking about new ways of tackling that problem, you should come to Aspen, because it is a largely left, Democratic-leaning, progressive city, as rich as that place may be, liberal in its political leanings. And at this time, this was late 1990s, early 2000s, it was a site where there was a great deal of nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, where people were saying, if we want to have a clean environment, we want to have clean air, water, and land, and we've got to, and I was waiting for them to say, we've got to control and regulate these industries. Like, no, we got to kick out the Mexicans. All of these brown folks who are coming over the border, they are contributing to the poisoning of our environment, and we need to call on the US Congress to build up and amplify and militarize the border for the sake of national security and environmental sustainability. Well, I will tell you, at the time we wrote this book, a number of people were saying, oh, this is just ridiculous. I'm not sure that any of this is actually representative of any sort of political philosophy worth talking about in the United States. And then along came Donald Trump and his wall. And believe me, underneath that is always an ideology and a narrative, not only of cultural and political and ethnic racial purity, but also of ecological purity. And there's a long history of that, of course, in Germany, Russia, many other parts of the world. And so for us, that was a real eye-opening experience, interviewing folks from Latin America who were being pushed out of this community, not just because they were of a different color or different racial or national and ethnic background, but because they were viewed as a form of cultural and environmental contamination. So that was one of the most eye-opening projects I've been involved in. Then I took a bit of a detour sometime after that. And I think at some level I was getting a little frustrated with a fair amount of reformism within the environmental justice community. And I was looking around for activists, advocates, movements who were really pushing the envelope on environmental and ecological change. And I found a community of folks who radical animal rights, animal liberation activists, radical left earth liberation activists who had no problem engaging in sabotage, arson, property damage, what became called eco-terrorism, to get their message across in defense of Mother Earth and in defense of non-human animal relations. And this project was one where I was asking really three questions. To what extent are these folks, these radical animal liberationists and hardcore left environmentalists, really just struggles over protecting animals and the earth, or are they also struggles over social inequality and combating hierarchy more generally? And the answer to that is they are. And second, of course, is I wanted to really delve into this idea of eco-terrorism, because for me, that was a worrisome thing, because it's that classic example of sort of low-hanging fruit, right? Let's go for the fringe, let's go for the radical left and call them eco-terrorists, pass federal legislation outlawing constitutionally protected speech and behaviors such as boycotts against fur industries and things like that, because that's the kind of thing that can creep into the mainstream. And boom, lo and behold, in numerous states around this country, we now have laws or laws being proposed that would outlaw peaceful, constitutionally nonviolent, constitutionally protected and nonviolent protest against fossil fuels, right? So here's the evidence that the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act that was passed in 2006 is now being built on that mission creep, where now mainstream folks who don't think of themselves as radical at all are being called terrorists, right? And we see this in racial justice movements as well. Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, with her new book called When They Call You a Terrorist, we're seeing that same sort of thing. So this is a clarion call to make sure that we're taking radical movements seriously, because we are one step away from being the subjects of repression. And if they are being repressed, all of us are at risk. And finally, I was very much interested in thinking about social movements led by human beings as always involving entanglements with non-human natures. And so an obvious example was of course is of course the animal liberation movement. So I had a lot of fun with that. One thing that wasn't so fun was what we call the Green Scare, this repression that I've talked about, the eco-terrorism label, the state, the FBI, the government coming after activists who were engaging in activities such as, let's say, arson, for which I think, as we all know, there are already laws on the books outlawing arson. But if you engage in arson and say that you do this because you want to protect the planet and Mother Earth, then you are now at risk of being caught up under federal eco-terrorism statutes. And that's exactly what happened to a number of activists who I interviewed. And the FBI came calling and to me, looking for information on these folks I was interviewing. And I got into a fair amount of trouble with that, but was lucky enough to stay out of jail, unlike some other scholars. So there again, that creep from the fringe to the center. And I never want to do that again, but I learned a hell of a lot from those activists, and my hat is off to them, because they are pushing the envelope in so many ways. And let me also just say, the label of eco-terrorism was also ridiculous, because not one human being has been harmed, let alone killed, as a result of what these movements have been up to. So then I decided to get back to more core environmental justice issues and matters of concern, but to try to push that a little step further. So just drawing on the research of a number of folks actually at the University of Michigan and other great citadels of environmental justice studies. And I came up with this idea of critical environmental justice studies, which again, not something that I really authored myself. It was more, I was just grabbing and borrowing generously from existing research. But the idea was to try to push this literature in a number of, I think, productive directions, looking at multiple categories of difference: race, class, gender, sexuality, age, ability, citizenship, species, thinking on multi-scalar registers from the local to the global and back, questioning state-centric analyses, thinking of the state as perhaps a necessary institutional apparatus that we need to theorize and work through, but not always thinking of the state as the exclusive site of resolution of environmental justice struggles. And then a more normative approach to all of this, which I think now resonates in this era of the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, where people are really dealing with a racial reckoning, I hope, and really naming this problem of expendability that many people of color, BIPOC communities face, and really saying, you know what, we're going to reject that peacefully, lovingly, and non-violently, and embrace this thing that I call indispensability, which means, to quote climate justice activists, to change everything, we need everyone. So I've focused that work on the Black Lives Matter movement, but now I'm really doing a deeper dive on this project I'm calling the Prison Environmental Justice Project. So since about 2015, I've been doing research on prisons and jails, detention centers or immigrant prisons, and juvenile prisons in the US and around the world, and linking those spaces of incarceration, of hostage taking, of kidnapping, of inherent torture and inherent violence to environmental justice concerns. And so using a range of research methods, I've been primarily focusing on the US, but now moving more internationally. Some of the work I'm doing on this project, building on work I've done in the past, is also framing this project in as an activist scholar approach. And so I'm very much interested in, even if just a small slice of this work can translate to real change on the ground to improve people's lives, I'd be happy with that. And one of the many organizations I've been working with to achieve that goal is the Prison Ecology Project, which is now morphed into something called the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. And so one of the things I'm proud of that they really led with a number of other folks was shutting down what would have been the single most expensive federal penitentiary in US history, which would have been located on the top of a former site of mountaintop removal, where coal mining occurred in the great state of Kentucky. Well, this organization, this whole coalition of folks, actually stopped that prison from being built. Short of stopping prisons from being built, we're very much interested in a pragmatic approach of improving conditions of confinement in prisons as long as we have them. This is a photo of tap water. It's very grainy. I apologize for that. But as you can see, the water, you probably don't want to drink this. This comes to me from the Avenal State Prison here in California. It's, of course, like just about any photo that you get out of a prison that reveals some hard truths. It was taken with a cell phone, which means it was taken illegally. Having a cell phone in prison is not permitted. And a gentleman sent me this thing. It was a video, and he said, I've had this tap on for 5 freaking minutes, and the water is still visibly contaminated. I interviewed another formerly incarcerated person who was in another facility out in California, and I'll call him Benjamin, and he said the water was black. Most of the time it was black. He said, I couldn't drink the water, so I couldn't hydrate myself, so I lost a lot of weight, end quote. And so that experience, and this photo here, is really reflective of widespread water contamination throughout prisons and jails throughout the United States. So we've got a whole host of toxic threats. This comes to us from the Northwest Detention Center. This is a photo from Seattle-Tacoma area, a privately operated 1,500 bed immigrant prison, smack dab right next to a federally designated toxic Superfund site. But this is what's happening in the present, right? Let's go back to the past. We're all very much aware of how chattel slavery gave way to convict leasing in the United States, where governments were just dragnetting people of color and then selling us, leasing us out to corporations. In convict leasing, which was, historians have consensus on this, a far more brutal system than chattel slavery, because there was no reason for companies to keep people alive. We could work them to death, no problem, and just get another person. This is a photo from the early 1900s, late 1800s, around that time, of African-American folks, clearly, who are in their stripes, prison stripes, convict leasing. They have been leased to the Tennessee Iron and Coal Company. So they're doing enslaved, forced, coerced labor to extract coal, which of course is perpetrating global anthropogenic climate change. And of course, Tennessee Iron and Coal Company later merged with US Steel, creating the first billion-dollar corporation in the United States, underscoring at least two things: the importance of white supremacy and enslavement and racial domination to this country's capitalist core, and of course, the long-standing problem of anthropogenic climate change. You could jump down to the colony, the territory of Puerto Rico. All of that island's prisons are part of an 8 8 complexes of carceral spaces that are, as you can see on this map, right on the coast in zones that are at risk of flooding due to sea level rise. And when we have extreme climate change driven weather events like Hurricane Eta and others, Hurricane Maria, Irma, hitting Puerto Rico extremely hard, the last people on earth any government is interested in evacuating during these extreme weather events are prisoners. And so this has become a major problem in terms of disaster planning and should be on our minds when we think about how to address climate change and thinking about that intersection of the prison industrial complex. Well, resistance, as you can imagine, is ubiquitous. It's widespread throughout jails, prisons, and detention centers around the world. This is a picture from April of last year, 2020, of the Lurigancho prison in Lima, Peru, where, as you can see, folks who are incarcerated have taken over the prison. They have climbed on the roof. They are protesting their conditions of confinement during the era of COVID-19, when social and physical distancing is impossible in any carceral space by design. And folks are dropping like flies. And so they rebelled. And many of them unfurled this banner, which reads, "We want COVID-19 tests. We have the right to live," end quote. Can you imagine? So I just also want to give a shout out to my extraordinary team here at the Global Environmental Justice Project that has been producing annual reports for the last 4 or 5 years. And this is the latest, the 2020 annual report. And we've had a lot of fun with that. But I want to end real quick with just the question of why environmental justice in prisons, because it gives me the opportunity to push environmental justice solutions beyond maybe a typical limited reformist orientation. Virtually every prisoner or formerly imprisoned person I've talked to has talked about abolition as a strategy. We think of, for me, one of the lasting contributions of the environmental justice movement is, and the scholarship is this narrative, this discursive reframing of the environment as those spaces where human beings live, work, play, learn, and pray. Well, we do all of those things in carceral spaces. So I'd like to add to that list and do time. There's also, of course, this long-standing debate around the minority move-in hypothesis. And of course, Paul Mohai has literally written the book and every article worth reading on this topic. And the idea that, of course, I think that helps a lot of people sleep at night, that environmental racism and injustice is a result of people of color and vulnerable populations following the pollution and the waste rather than the other way around. Paul Mohai, Robin Saha have really put that debate to rest with their extraordinary research, which really demonstrates that that hypothesis is really moot, and it's more so in the prison space where people have virtually no choice, no agency over where they're living. And if they're living in a toxic environment, then that's a problem. One of the things that I've really taken heart and inspiration from is the fact that leaders in the environmental justice movement aren't just people in frontline and fence line residential communities, but they are also folks who are behind prison walls, incarcerated persons who are bringing lawsuits against the prison systems, who are writing poetry and beautiful essays and doing investigative reporting from behind prison walls, and who are mobilizing to promote environmental justice. Which means, of course, that since these folks, according to the 13th Amendment, are constitutionally, legally, and juridically enslaved human beings, the environmental justice movement from behind prison walls is also, to some degree, I think, accurately described as a slave rebellion, which means that the environmental justice movement, at least in that sense, in the prison industrial complex, is continuing the good work of abolition movements that really began centuries ago. The last thing I want to say is I'm grappling with this idea, particularly in the 21st century, as we see the rise of fascism, of reframing environmental injustice and racism in ways that will engender urgency. And so one of those ways I'm doing that is to frame environmental injustice and racism as a form of warfare. And I do that for 3 or 4 reasons, because it involves direct assaults by states, state-supported institutions on entire communities. This results in massive harm to entire communities and ecosystems. It is also, of course, like any form of warfare, designed to maintain the health of valued, differentially valued and privileged populations and groups, and What this means is that states and corporations see so-called environmental justice communities not as environmental justice communities, but as targets and enemies worthy of contamination, worthy of expendability, and an annihilation in many cases. And so for me, this means that the environmental justice movement and scholarship could be reframed as anti-militarist, as a peace movement, and as a movement that is promoting nonviolent social change. And so the last thing I'll say is a big thanks to my extraordinary team of scholars and researchers here, students here at the University of California, Santa Barbara for their good work. And I'll pipe down, and I'm happy to take questions and comments and hear from Sam to start us off. So thank you so much.
Yeah, David, thank you so much. What an incredible survey of all your work and seeing all of the many, many things that have kept you busy over the years. But thank you again for sharing your work and perspective with us. I know many of us, myself included, have been looking forward to this for a really long time. And as you know, this is the culmination of our lunchtime lecture series. And I can't really think of a better combo, a more perfect combo than Dr. Mohai introducing you and then yourself to wrap up everything and leave us with a few thoughts to ponder and work through the type of society that we want to live in, and then ultimately that we want to all help shape. So for those of you that maybe missed the very intro of the call, my name is Sam Buck. I actually went to UC Santa Barbara, as I was sharing with Dr. Pellow earlier, and I did that as an undergrad. So it's fun to see these worlds kind of colliding. Now I'm a dual graduate degree student here at the University of Michigan, where I'm exploring the intersection of sustainability and business and philanthropy and a lot of ties to everything that Dr. Pellow just shared. And it's my hope that, ultimately we'll be able to find a path towards a way of life that supports all people, not just today, but for many, many generations to come, and help them live within the bounds of our planet. And I am admittedly relatively new to the environmental justice field. And I will say that has helped me so appreciate your work, Dr. Pellow, because you lend such a vital perspective in understanding where the EJ movement has been, where it is now, and where we think that it's headed, and where we hope that it's headed. So I'm excited to dive in and have this conversation with you. But before diving into all that, I do want to embrace the importance of perspective and setting and building on some of my peers' really wonderful work of acknowledging the land that we're symbolically gathered on today, even as we're in this Zoom room. So the University of Michigan stands on the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe people, who are also known as the people of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, who are also known as the Chippewa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and the Wyandot nations. The Anishinaabe lived on and stewarded the land now known as the Great Lakes for hundreds of years before settlers created this colonial state of Michigan. And the university was granted this land in the Treaty of Fort Meigs in 1817. At the time, the Anishinaabe were promised higher education for their youth. And unfortunately, that promise is left largely unhonored by the university to this day. And so it's our building of communities and conversations that's a mindful step towards action on these really critical justice agendas. And this lecture series has been a meaningful exploration of how we've both knowingly and unknowingly perpetrated the violence and harm, but it's also been a means of exploring what reconciliation might look like. And while we recognize that these words certainly are not going to have the power to change the past or undo it, it's my hope that these conversations we're having can drive and inspire the change needed for a more equitable future, one where we work to correct for some of those injustices. So with that in mind, I think that this is going to be a vibrant discussion. I hope it's going to be a vibrant discussion. And my shout out to the audience, that requires a two-way street. So to everyone, please submit questions or thoughts for Dr. Pellow using the Q&A feature. I'll be monitoring that throughout the conversation and trying to bring in your thoughts and comments, not just my own. But I will get us started. So I'm struck in these conversations that you're asked to deliver a talk in half an hour, sometimes 20 minutes, that summarizes years and years, decades worth of work. And there is so much that remains hidden behind those slides that you shared with us, Dr. Pellow. So maybe we can start by taking a peek behind those slides. And I'd love to start just by unpacking the critical EJ framework that you came up with. So it, of course, ultimately ended up with these very neat four-part buckets, the four-part framework. I'm wondering, how did you get there? What's on the cutting room floor? What was left behind? What was the process for creating that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. And before I get into that, I do want to say thank you for that land acknowledgement, and particularly your point about the ways in which the University of Michigan was granted title, and at the same moment that Indigenous folks were being denied that access. And here, my own university is literally on a site where Indigenous Chumash folks for centuries not only lived and traded, but also it was a space of education within Chumash communities and with their neighbors and folks they interacted with. So we're trying to honor that and dig deeper into that, and acknowledge that. So thank you for that. So in terms of the critical environmental justice framework, I mean, I guess I would say I really do want to emphasize that it was something that I think a number of scholars were already doing, and then I literally just gave a name to this thing. But I mean, I think about the first pillar. Let's examine more categories of difference than maybe just sort of race and class. And I didn't come up with that. I'm just surveying a bunch of literature and saying, hey, let's actually put this together and acknowledge that we're doing that, and to promote that and lift that up. The second pillar on multi-scalar analyses, I mean, much of that, I mean, comes from social scientists and of course geographers who've been doing that for quite some time. The questioning of state-centric analyses, I mean, that definitely, I think, is a direct link, a through line between that and the previous project of total liberation, where I found myself in the good graces of an anarchist community, global anarchist community, who were really pushing a different way of analyzing our current situation and possibilities for future change. And I was pleased to see that some folks in geography, some historians, even legal scholars, and American studies and ethnic studies and gender studies folks were also embracing that. And I think it's safe to say that people, including myself, are somewhat reticent about describing ourselves as anarchists. But I'll definitely say that I lean in that direction, and it's truly eye-opening. And for me, it's really important at this very moment, where we have seen again the rise of fascism and white supremacy in this country and in so many countries around the world, and not just white supremacy, but multiple forms of supremacy: Hindu nationalism, Zionism, right? All sorts of things like that. So this isn't just like white folks dominating; it's anybody in any country who's dominating other folks. We can go to Nigeria, and folks there might say, I'm not so sure that white supremacy is our greatest problem. We have various other forms of supremacy here we're dealing with. And then for me, finally, that fourth pillar around indispensability was just something that I think was bubbling below the surface, that I think as a scholar, I felt I needed to say, but was hesitant to say, that we need to actually put a normative, moral, ethical framework out there that to change everything, we need everyone. And this is an all of us or none situation. Several things left on the cutting floor. I will say from the very beginning in the writing, I said, this isn't meant to be a comprehensive sort of theoretical framework. It's meant to be a canvas upon which I and maybe others can put down some thoughts. It's a framework. And it's not meant to be the be all end all. It doesn't do, for example, a very good job at all of tackling the very important issue of decolonization, for example. Let me just put that out there, right? So in no way is it meant to be comprehensive, but it is meant to be something that people can build on, can critique, can nix if they don't want. I just saw an article published in the journal Environmental Sociology, where a grad student at Oregon did a brilliant job of really critiquing the anarchist leanings in the critical environmental justice framework, and I really appreciate that. So plenty of room for improvement to build on that. So just some brief thoughts to your excellent questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so much to dig in there, and I love that you frame it as a canvas, right? That it's going to continue to evolve, and people will paint on top of it and paint over it and paint to the side. That's wonderful. So I want to dig a little bit deeper on one of the things that you mentioned on the anti-authoritarian piece, and how you yourself maybe lean a little bit towards the anarchy side, but there's still this reticence to actually put that label on it. But some of the core ideas hold some real value and hold weight. if you could unpack some of those thoughts a little bit more for me. Is there a real need to dismantle the social and legal structures that have caused much of the oppression that we're seeing, rather than work to reinvent those structures, as I think, is existing in mainstream media today?
Yeah, so I really appreciate that question. And I think it's very much the way you framed it resonates with me, because it's very much a parallel with the ongoing conversation around abolition, right, of the prison industrial complex, defunding the police, and all of the rest. And I think it's been amazing the progress that we've made in the last year in even having that conversation move toward the mainstream. Of course, now there's significant pushback against some of those ideas. But when you have scholar activists like Ruth Wilson Gilmore being given a major space and time in the New York Times, for example, on this question of abolition, I feel like this is a moment. This is a moment where we can really dig deep into these issues and take them seriously. So to your specific question there at the end, I think is really important, because for me, abolition, like anarchism, isn't so much about let's tear down the prison industrial complex, let's tear down the state. What I think is most productive and generative from abolitionists and anarchists is to say, hey, let's demonstrate that there are alternatives, and let's build community institutions and resources and mutual aid and support in our communities, so that the state, so that the prison system, so that policing, so that these forms of authoritarian state-centered and institutional violence become irrelevant, or become not so centered, but become decentered. And people realize, what, there are other ways that we can provide critical needs and resources to our communities, other ways we can solve our problems without always relying, frankly, on not only authoritarian, but violent and ecocidal and inherently racist institutions. That's, for me, the crux of the problem. So, for example, here we're working on a Green New Deal in my region. And that's a very pragmatic approach that's saying, yes, we're going to work with the state. We're also going to work with all sorts of mutual aid organizations, community-based and grassroots organizations, to try to create change, a just transition from the bottom up. So as I said, I'm leading in the anarchist direction, but for me, I'm a very pragmatic anarchist. Arturo Escobar, James Scott, and other scholars have said, yeah, as long as there is a state, we're going to have to work with and through that state, right? But build up those institutions that make at least the worst and most violent and most authoritarian dimensions of the state, put them on trial, make them more visible, have us acknowledge them as the least preferred options. But marginalized, precarious, and vulnerable communities have the right and the obligation to challenge folks like me and to say, where in the world am I going to get protection for my life, for my well-being, for my quality of life, for my identity, for my existence? And I will respond, I'm with you. And I would also ask you a very hard question. Show me some concrete examples of a sustained commitment by any state on earth to the rights of indigenous peoples, people of color, trans and queer folks, and other marginalized communities. You can't do it. You cannot do it. You can show me punctuated examples here and there. Here's a law, here's a policy, etc. But sustained protection and defense and support of marginalized communities, the state isn't about that. And so we've got to think through other ways of building up alternatives. So that's hopefully a partial answer to your excellent question.
I love that. And I really love the framing of being a pragmatic anarchist. I'm going to take that with me. I absolutely love that. And also the idea that it's not necessarily a full topple, but certainly showing that there are more compelling alternatives. So to that end, I'll ask a follow-up question, and then I know there's a couple great things coming in the Q&A, so I'll turn it to other people's great thoughts, and it looks like there's some in the chat too. But if you could maybe identify some of the largest obstacles that you see in the way of showing what those alternatives are, and then maybe where you're seeing cracks starting to show where there's a real opportunity to advance these initiatives.
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest obstacle is just the centuries of conditioning that we've so many of us, most of us have experienced, that the state is the site of the resolution of our struggles and of our needs. And another obstacle, of course, is the need for greater resources in education, right? The way that our history and our current political and legal landscape is taught in universities and in primary and secondary school is a huge obstacle to that. I was reminded the other day, I was reading a journal submission where somebody was pointing out, for example, pushing back against many African-American leaders who pushed back against me and other folks saying, no, we need the state for our civil rights, for our human rights. Well, this scholar was saying, really? Let's take a look actually at what the state has done to us, right? And for us, right? But also the history of, for example, just in one community, Black liberation movements for decades, if not centuries, engaging in mutual aid, engaging in self-reliance, engaging in grassroots resource sharing and production and distribution, precisely because this racist, ecocidal, patriarchal state is not going to do it for us. So those are some of the primary obstacles, and where the cracks are, or what I would call openings, are exactly that, like teaching those histories, but looking at the present, what we just saw with the polar vortex across much of the United States in February of this year, cutting power and water to millions of people across the land. What we saw, and of course with the COVID-19 pandemic, what we're seeing is, in the absence of the state providing the basic resources that people need, we are seeing ordinary people coming together. A friend of mine in New York, she and her collective literally sewed some 20,000 masks for people when the government of New York was doing nothing, handing these masks out on the street corner to people. Friends of mine in Houston, Texas, doing the same thing and providing food and clean water to folks during the February 2021 polar vortex, when the state, when the corporations were doing nothing. The Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition is a group that's a part of that in that international campaign for responsible technology that I referenced earlier. They have led the movement to not only get laws passed to make the electronics industry globally more environmentally just, but they've also said we need to lead corporate campaigns. Any good environmental activist will tell you that's what you got to do. You can't just rely on the state to make change, which is why we went after IBM, Dell, HP, Compaq, and all of these other companies to make them directly responsible and accountable to us in terms of their own policies and practices on waste management, toxic use reduction, recycling, labor rights, etc., which, by the way, are practices that, just like in government, you have to be eternally vigilant to make sure they're continuing to be monitored and in place, but also that can outlast, in many cases, any given presidential or gubernatorial administration. So again, that's the pragmatic anarchist in me. I'm looking for every tool in the toolbox and every front that we can make change. And that's my problem with so much of social change, is that there's this view that there's only one way, right? Let's only go to the state house. Let's only go to the city council. Let's only go to Congress and the White House and the Senate. That's a losing game, because as we know, in 18 months, things might flip. What's your long game? What's the long haul? So for me, it's education. It's taking a look at what people have always been doing in their communities in the context of white supremacy and capitalism to provide for themselves and each other in the absence of state support. So there's just such a long history of that. We just need to open our eyes to it and build on it.
I'm going to fight every fiber of my being and not be selfish and steal follow-up questions for myself and turn to some of the other great things coming in through the Q&A. One of the questions is if you could speak to the role you see for arts and culture in the environmental justice and racial justice movements. They certainly have a vital role to play. And what role do you see that being?
Yes, absolutely. It's extremely important, as it is to any social movement worth its salt. I would say, though, early on, for me, taking a look just comparatively at, say, the civil rights movement, which my parents were deeply involved in when they were in college, and the early days of the environmental justice movement, I think it's safe to say that there was a much stronger role of the arts, singing, portraiture, painting, etc., in the civil rights movement than there had been in the early environmental justice movement. We're seeing that change now. And I have to say, one of my favorite artists is Ricardo Levens Morales, who's in the Twin Cities. You can check him out. He has got some incredible paintings, extraordinary art that really captures so much of the anxiety and a vision of hope within the environmental justice movement. He's based in Minneapolis. So Ricardo Levens Morales. and incredible work. We're also seeing poetry. I think I mentioned this earlier in terms of the prisoner-led environmental justice movement. So much of that work, so much of that leadership from within the carceral spaces is artistic. We are seeing folks like Marius Mason, the political prisoner, Mumia Abul Jamal, Oscar Lopez Rivera, other folks, political prisoners who are producing beautiful artwork and portraiture and paintings, incredible poetry that is being produced by folks on the inside. Gary Fowler, I just saw some poetry by him, an incarcerated person in the Southwest United States. So this, like all art, it motivates us. It opens up new ways of thinking and therefore new ways of acknowledging and trying our situation and new possibilities for a change. So it gives me hope, it gives me inspiration, and it's part of the fuel behind this movement.
That's incredible. Thank you. I'm gonna have to go check out some of Ricardo's work after I hop off this call. I know that we're coming up on the 1 o'clock time. If it works with you, David, I'd love to go just a few minutes over because there are some cool questions rolling in. Maybe we'll plan to do about 10 minutes, keep it to Michigan time that we just told you about.
Let's do it. And thanks to Rebecca for dropping in that link in the chat. Absolutely. Let's keep going, Stan.
Yeah, great. So this is coming in from the Q&A. When you're doing your ethnographies, how do you navigate the ethical questions behind going into a commonly exploited by researchers community? This is an issue that whoever this is coming into conflict with, and they'd really love your advice on your approach there.
Yeah, no, super important question. And, you know, I'm really glad that we have, of course, IRBs and human subjects review boards. It's also the case that a number of indigenous nations, indigenous tribes, have their own IRBs and human subjects processes, precisely because, as we know, there has been so much exploitation, so much extractivism and siphoning off of critical knowledge from communities of color, BIPOC communities, without gaining consent and without collaboration or attribution. And so I would say I'm still learning about this. I'm still working on this, but one of the things, a number of things I like to do is, of course, you know, when I'm entering a community that has been exploited, that is vulnerable, that may be precarious in some ways, I am always mindful of that history and mindful of those town gown and university community divides. And so one of the things I do is I tell folks, hey, look, I have been a part of this struggle. Here's, you know, my resume. Here's some folks you can connect with in my network who can vet me, who can vouch for me. And I'm actually not, you know, making the pretense of objectivity. I'm on your side, but like any good scholar and any good activist, I'm also very reflexive about the work I do. And this is why, you know, I came up with the idea of critical environmental justice. I'm down with environmental justice, but I also am down with making sure that we are being self-critical so that our work is more rigorous and it's more impactful. So it's not going to be the case that any and every community that I'm working within, I'm just going to report on them as just being awesome and flawless and uncomplicated. No, we're all human beings, and I will present to my mind, you know, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but from a perspective of solidarity. And so what I also do is I'm very clear with folks that they can vet the work before it is published. And the other thing I do fairly frequently is collaborate with non-academics. And that's nothing new. A lot of us do that, but that also keeps me honest. And I stay in these communities. You know, so my dissertation, which turned into the book Garbage Wars, I am still in close contact with the Johnson family. Cheryl Johnson, Hazel Johnson, her mother, may she rest in peace, gave me my start in this work. The leaders, the executive director of the group People for Community Recovery. So I've maintained close contact with folks who let me into their communities and into their homes, and I remain accountable to them. So that's a bit of an answer to, I think, that very important question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to loop back on one of your previous responses where you mentioned the Green New Deal, because I know that you have done some really wonderful work with the Central Coast Climate Justice Network, and I believe some students of yours at UCSB on shaping what the Green New Deal would look like for the Central Coast of California. And I'd love for you just to unpack what the localized context of that Green New Deal conversation looks like, and do we need to advance more of those local conversations around this policy?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, this has been a really amazing journey where, the Central Coast Climate Justice Network, which is a fairly new network of folks from mainstream white-led environmental organizations who got together consciously with people of color and BIPOC-led organizations and said, let's quash this BS, this tension between us, but let's acknowledge it and let's work through it. But we have got to do that because we've got major problems. We can't afford to be divided and polarized. And so let's work for environmental and climate justice, food justice, immigrant and indigenous justice together collectively. And one of the things we're working on is this Green New Deal. And in this context, in the Central Coast of California, we are an agriculture heavy industry here, region where it's a tourism heavy industry, it's a cannabis heavy industry, but we also have significant BIPOC communities here, a lot of wealth and a great deal of poverty. We've also got a great diversity of ecological habitats. We've got mountains, the Los Padres National Forest. We've got the ocean right here. We've got a set semi-desert environment. All of these, this rich demographic and ecological realities, and strong NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And so we got together and decided, let's draw on the history of mobilization for social change from BIPOC communities. And one of those inspirations comes to us from the United Farm Workers and doing house meetings, focus groups in people's homes. Now we're doing it on Zoom to get an idea of what is it you like about your community? What is it you want to change about your community? And what might that look like in terms of a Green New Deal? So we've got college students, we've got the Fearless Grandmothers organizations, we've got indigenous communities, farm workers, youth, labor union leaders, faith-based organizations, and of course, environmental and climate justice organizations who are coming together to articulate a vision of a Green New Deal for our community. And it's taken a hell of a lot longer than it has in most other Green New Deal situations around the country, because we just decided we wanted to be really deeply grassroots with respect to this. But we are going to release a draft of the document of our framework next week. And very unanarchist of me, the next thing I'm going to be doing is lobbying people in the county government to implement this thing. So that's been a really fun process that's been led by our NGOs. And I've just been honored to be allowed to be a part of that process.
It takes being a chameleon. I appreciate that you're able to wear many different suits, flex as you need to. So there's another thing coming in through the Q&A, and I'll share it now. It's not a question, but I know that you can't see it because for everyone out there that's just seeing the chat function. But this is from Ari Renda. Hi, Dr. Pellow. I wanted to share, I've been so grateful for the ways that you've brought abolition, mutual aid, and challenging the state into the academic and environmental space over the last years. And I know that we all echo Ari's sentiments. Thank you for the great work you've been doing. One more question I have for you. So we were talking before the recording of this started about some of the assignments that you actually give to your students. So there was that corporate strategy assignment, and I'm wondering if I can flip the script and assign it to you right now. If you were to write that corporate strategy paper, what solicited or unsolicited advice would you be giving to corporations that do want to start addressing some of these issues and adopting your critical EJ framework?
Yeah, thank you for that, flipping the script on me. Well, I might have a chance to do that in a couple weeks. I'm giving a talk to an organization that advises corporations on sustainability and socially responsible strategies. And that's probably the first time I'm doing that in a long time. And I've been involved in good neighbor agreement negotiations with corporations, most of which really failed. Because like, could you give a damn about your workers and the environment? No? Okay, just asking. But I think people are waking up more and more because we are seeing a real strength and real muscle flexing on the part of the environmental justice and climate justice movement. And and combining that, of course, with this racial reckoning that we're seeing, where a lot of corporations are at least giving lip service, if not actually changing policies and practices around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And so for me, and this goes back to the very beginnings in many ways of the environmental justice movement, in those difficult conversations we were having with mainstream white middle class environmentalists, and around this repeated problem of mainstream environmentalists in many cases saying, you know what, we're perfectly fine with shutting down an offending corporation if you don't clean up your act. When a lot of folks in communities of color and low wealth communities were saying, we're not fine with that because that pays our freaking rent, that puts food on the table, and we get it. We care as much, if not more, about pollution of our lands, our air, our water, and our communities, our homes, and our bodies than anybody else. We should. We're on the front lines and we're on the fence line. But we are not willing to give up a paycheck in many cases. And because we're forced to make that most difficult decision, right, between being poisoned and feeding ourselves. And so I want to promote a corporate strategy that takes environmental justice and climate justice seriously, but that also goes deep into understanding the limits of sustainability. I was having a conversation with a representative of Patagonia several weeks ago, who was representing their founder, Yvon Chouinard, who gave a talk at my university, who said, the idea of sustainability is ridiculous. There is no thing that we as human beings do on planet Earth that doesn't have an impact. So everything we do is going to have an impact. The question is, do we acknowledge that and we try to minimize that? But I'm a real believer in regenerative development. So for me, sustainability is sort of like a green Hippocratic oath, right? First, do no harm to the environment. But regenerative development says, let's go deeper than that. Why can't we imagine building our cities, our built environments, building our corporations, the business of commerce, the business of business and governance in ways that not only create healthful situations and improve quality of life for human beings, but that also allow for our ecological, our habitats to also flourish. So for me, I think we have to aim high, we have to make tall orders and ask, how can corporations promote not just sustainability and justice, but regenerative development? And so, but I'm all ears if you have suggestions for how we can promote that, because I need help. I'm giving a talk on May 3rd on this very issue. So please give me some guidance. So that's just a start. Thanks.
Everyone can send in guidance and advice for David to the Q&A, and I'll relay it. You may have actually just preempted my final question, because I know we're coming up on the extended time that I already set. But David, there's a number of different generations of EJ activists and researchers and people that are in this field on the call. And I'm wondering if you could put yourself in our shoes and people that are currently in this master's program looking to take the EJ field the distance, take it to the next level. What kind of trends are you seeing that you would be focusing your time on if you were in our shoes right now? And maybe at the same time, sort of closing comments on your end.
Sure. There's so many trends that I see that are really, really inspiring. I mean, I love when I see folks who are collaborating across sectors, whether it's corporate, governmental, or NGO sectors. I love it when I see people, especially right now, understanding that democracy, and I'm using that term very, very broadly, not just in the sense of having voting rights access, but the importance of democracy to environmental justice and to sustainability of our environment. And therefore, the flip side of that, the importance of pushing back peacefully, lovingly, and non-violently, but most definitively against fascism and racism, because those things are not just bad for decent human beings, but they are bad for the environment. It's been proven empirically that democracy and social equity are good, not only for people, but for our environment. So that's a trend I'm seeing. Greenpeace, for example, has not only a plastics and a forest and a climate campaign, Greenpeace has a democracy campaign. And it's led by a person of color, Folabi. This guy is incredible, who really gets that, right? We're not going to have a sustainable environment if we don't have a democratic society. I'm also really, really heartened to see this trend of saying, you know what? All of human history and all of human society is not just about humans, but it's always been about multi-species. And if it's always been about multi-species societies, and we're recognizing that, then why can't we also push that envelope and say that we need to think about our governance decisions, our polity, right, as a multi-species reality? So what would multi-species justice look like if we're taking the fact seriously that this isn't just about us, and it's not just about vulnerable human beings. It's about making sure that each and every one of us in a multi-species context is seen as indispensable to creating a collective future that is resilient, just, equitable, and sustainable. And so those are some of the trends that I see that I'm really heartened by. But you know what? I'm an old dude, middle-aged guy, and I need to shut up and listen every once in a while. And I've been doing that every year. That's my New Year's resolution, to listen to folks. And I will say that the most exciting insights on this research project that I'm doing on prisons have come directly from the students that I've been working with. So I've been really fortunate to surround myself with folks from the younger generation who are pushing the envelope, who are pushing the analysis and the action in new directions that I never would have thought of. And so I'm all about having those multi-generational exchanges. So thank you.
No, thank you. Well, we've all enjoyed listening to you today. So really, really appreciate you coming in and sharing those words.
Yeah, it's been an amazing multi-generational conversation today. In fact, I have to tip my hat to Sam and to all the students who've really led and facilitated this with precisely those kinds of contributions in mind, which is figuring out what we as elders in the field have to offer those emerging now as new leaders on our heels. And it really just leaves me every week feeling like I've had a hit of pure oxygen. Many of you in the chat have dropped comments into that effect today, noting that you're keeping your Thursdays at noon free for next fall when we will resume the lecture series. And in the meantime, for all of you who felt frustrated by not catching everything in the chat or the Q&A or out of David's mellifluous lips, we can think about tuning into the archive of this, which will be up in no time on our website, and you can catch this conversation for what it offers you in your own practice, in your own work going forward. I will stop the recording. A couple of us can hang out online. I want to thank again my colleague Paul for kicking us off, David for walking us through this amazing body of work, and Sam for bringing it into the current moment from where you're sitting and working and learning on these issues. It's just been a phenomenal afternoon. So I will say farewell to all of you until September, when the wonderful Melissa Bartlett and I will be back, and many of you will also be back. So thank you for that. High rates of alumni attendees today. High rates of return attendees. We are building a beloved community. I want to thank all of you for being in it with us, and have a fantastic few months doing good work.
Ooh, second to that. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here today. Michigan is an extraordinary institution. Y'all have defined this field and you have led it. And I'm always happy to be a part of this conversation and to follow in your footsteps. So thank you so much for having me today.
Paul, any final last words?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. Well, yeah, David, you're amazing. I took a lot of notes. I'm just so impressed with your ability to see the multi-dimensional aspects of environmental justice specifically, but I think social justice much more broadly. And I'm not overstating by saying that I was inspired, and I suspect everybody that listened to you today was inspired. So I just want to personally thank you, and all I can say is let's do it more often.
Amen to that. Bye everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, David.
Take care, Paul.